Chapter 4 of the Quran is titled An-Nisa, meaning the women. Muslim apologists routinely cite it as a masterpiece of female rights, a revolutionary leap forward, and a beacon of divine justice. But open the book, you don't find rights, you find domination, division, and discipline. Let's take a look at what Surah An-Nisa actually says about women. Let's start with verse 3. This is the ultimate verse apologists use to claim that Islam limited polygamy and brought ethics to marriage. According to Sahih al-Bukhari and Tafsir Ibn Kathir, the context stems from the aftermath of the Battle of Uhud. Male guardians were in charge of wealthy, vulnerable orphan girls. Guardians were marrying these young orphans not out of love, but to seize their wealth and dowries. The Quran's solution was, if you can't be fair to orphan girls, go marry up to 4 other women instead. Look closely at the mechanics. 1. A woman's agency is non existent in the text. The directive is aimed entirely at men, what men can choose, what men can possess, and how men can distribute their desires. 2. The sex slave loophole. The Quran says if you can't handle multiple wives fairly, stick to one or what your right hand possesses. Ma Malakat Aymanukum. Classical mufassirun, including Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari, unanimously state this refers to female captives and slaves. Notice the moral contradiction. The verse pretends to care about fairness to wives, but completely strips female slaves of consent, human rights, and bodily autonomy. Men get a quota on free women, but an unlimited license for concubines. How is a system that caps wives at 4 while keeping human trafficking and sexual slavery legal a win for women's rights? Now, jump forward in the exact same chapter to verse 129. The text literally admits a glaring internal contradiction. Classical commentators like Ibn Kathir explain that men, including the Prophet himself, found it impossible to love multiple wives equally. Classical tafsir like Ibn Kathir and Sahih al-Bukhari point to a specific historical event behind this verse. Muhammad's aging wife, Sauda bint Zam'a, fearing she was going to be divorced because Muhammad favored the much younger Aisha, Sauda voluntarily surrendered her assigned night with him to Aisha just to keep her title as a wife. This wasn't a story of harmonious marital balance. It was a desperate sacrifice by an older woman bargaining away her basic marital intimacy simply to avoid being discarded in a system that openly favored youth and beauty. Because men were favoring younger or preferred wives, the older or less favored wives were being neglected. So this verse was revealed to give men a pass. In verse 3, justice is framed as the strict prerequisite for polygamy, but verse 129 openly admits that total human justice is impossible. Logically, if the required condition, which is justice, cannot be met, polygamy should be forbidden. But instead of banning polygamy, the Quran lowers the bar for men. The tafsir of Sa'di and Ibn Kathir clarified that as long as a husband provides basic food and shelter, his emotional neglect and favoritism towards another woman are divine privileges excused by God. The system openly acknowledges that polygamy subjects women to emotional cruelty and inevitable bias. Yet, rather than protecting women from that harm, the law simply tells men to hide their favoritism just enough to keep the secondary wives under their legal control. Now we come to the most notorious verse in the entire chapter, verse 34. This is the structural backbone of gender hierarchy in Islam, establishing male authority and sanctioning physical violence against wives. Why was it revealed? According to Asbab al-Nuzul by al-Wahidi and classical tafsir like al-Jassas, a woman came to Muhammad, complaining that her husband had slapped her face. Muhammad initially told her that she was entitled to qisas, equal legal retribution to, slap him back. However, before she could do so, verse 34 was declared to overrule the woman's claim. The first revoked a woman's right to defend herself and legally protected a husband's right to strike his wife. The verse opens by declaring men as caretakers or rulers over women. الرجال قوامون على النساء. Tafsir Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari state explicitly that men are over women because men are intellectually and inherently superior in divine ranking, framing female obedience as a religious requirement rather than a personal choice. Notice the legal trigger for physical discipline. Those from whom you fear arrogance/disobedience. The husband doesn't even need proven misconduct. Mere suspicion or fear of a wife stepping out of line grants him divine authority to enact a three-stage punitive measure. Apologists often try to soften Wadribuuhunna, strike them, by adding modern parenthetical translators like lightly or suggesting a toothpick like miswak. But classical jurisprudence and tafsir from Al-Qurtubi and Al-Razi acknowledge the core legal principle. The physical act itself is codified as a valid disciplinary tool for a male authority figure over a subordinate wife. A system that grants one gender legal guardianship while reducing the other to a domestic subordinate subject to physical punishment isn't protection, it's institutional domestic abuse. Now, let's look at financial independence. Apologists often claim that early Islam gave women groundbreaking property rights, but when you examine how estate law is actually structured across Surah An-Nisa, a consistent pattern emerges. A woman's economic value is legally codified as half that of a man's. Islam did grant women a mandatory share, but instead of establishing equal economic personhood, it locked in a permanent divine 2-to-1 male favor. Verse 11 explicitly commands that a son receives double the share of a daughter. The standard defense is men have financial obligations, nafaqa, while women get to keep their money. But with this excuse relies on the practice that patriarchal practice that Islam actually built. By legally denying women equal wealth, Islam actually forces them to depend financially on fathers, brothers, and husbands and male figures in the family, creating a structural cycle of female dependency. Compare what happens when a spouse dies. If a wife dies childless, her husband inherits 50% of her estate. If a husband dies childless, his wife inherits 25%. If there are children, the widower gets 25%, while the widow gets a mere 12.5%. And if he had multiple wives, they have to split that 12.5% among themselves. Just in case anyone thought the 2-to-1 ratio was a temporary measure, the very last verse revealed in Surah An-Nisa, verse 176, closes the chapter by repeating the exact same rule for siblings. A brother receives double the share of a sister. The verse literally ends with, Allah makes this clear to you lest you go astray. The Quran explicitly frames equal inheritance as going astray. In a system built by divine decree, a woman's financial worth is permanently locked in at 50% of a man's. That isn't equality, it's economic subordination by design. Apologists often point to verse 19 as proof that Islam liberated women from being treated like property, and on the surface, the headline does sound progressive. It is not lawful for you to inherit women by force. But when you dig into the context and look at what the text actually protects versus what it deliberately leaves intact, the hypocrisy becomes undeniable. Why was it revealed? According to Sahih al-Bukhari and Tafsir Ibn Kathir, in pre-Islamic Arabia, when a man died, his male relatives would automatically inherit his widow like an old rug or a piece of furniture. The new male heir could force her to marry him, or marry her off to someone else and pocket her dowry, or lock her away until she paid him money to buy back her freedom. Verse 19 was revealed to abolish this practice for free Muslim women. It's also crucial to point out a massive historical sleight of hand here. Apologists love to frame this verse as a revolutionary rescue mission, claiming Islam ended the barbaric practice of inheriting widows as chattel. The problem: there is zero external historical evidence that this custom ever actually existed. Outside of traditional Islamic texts written centuries later, there is not a single rock inscription, papyrus fragment, or contemporary legal document proving widows were inherited like property in ancient Arabia. Extensive accounts by Greek and Roman historians who studied Arabian customs in details, such as like Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and Procopius, documented marriage and inheritance norms among the Nabateans, Yemenis, and Bedouins, yet none of them ever mentioned widows being inherited as chattel or forced to marry their stepsons. Islam invented a narrative about a barbaric past purely to position its own restrictive laws as a divinely guided upgrade. Notice the glaring double standard. The Quran outlawed inheriting free women against their will, but what about the female captives and enslaved women? They were explicitly classified as property, milk. Under Islamic jurisprudence and classical tafsir, slave women were routinely inherited by male heirs upon an owner's death, along with livestock and real estate. Not only were enslaved women inherited as physical property, but the male heirs also inherited the divine right to have unsanctioned sexual relations with them. Consent was completely irrelevant. Islam didn't ban the concept of inheriting human beings. Human autonomy wasn't recognized as an intrinsic human right for all women. It was a privilege granted only to free women while maintaining a vast legal market for female sex slavery. How can a divine book claim to protect women's dignity in verse 19 while legally allowing men to buy, inherit, and sexually exploit enslaved women throughout the rest of the chapter? Right after verse 19, apologists love to quote verse 20 as proof of financial protection for women. The verse instructs men that if they want to divorce a wife and swap her out for a new one, they aren't allowed to take back the dowry, mahr, they paid her, even if it was a massive amount of wealth. At first glance, it sounds like a consumer protection law, but step back and look at the underlying dynamic being normalized here. Why is it fundamentally misogynistic? The Arabic phrasing used in the verse is istibdala zawjain makana zawj, literally replacing slash substituting a spouse in place of another spouse. The text casually codifies marriage not as a mutual covenant between equals, but as an open ended subscription service for men. The husband holds absolute unilateral power to discard one woman whenever he grows tired of her and trade her in for a newer model. He doesn't need her consent to divorce her. He doesn't need a valid legal reason. He just needs to decide he wants to replace her. The law merely tells him, keep your hands off the purchase price you already paid. A woman, on the other hand, cannot decide to replace her husband. She has to beg for a khula, divorce, which usually requires her to return her entire dowry and often depends on the husband's or a male judge's permission. Protecting a woman's dowry when you throw her out of her own home isn't empowerment, it's settling the bill on a transaction. In verse 24, we arrive at the absolute lowest point of human rights in the entire chapter. The verse starts by listing women you are forbidden from sleeping with, specifically women who are already married. That sounds reasonable enough, but then comes a horrific, explicit exception. The Asbab al-Nuzul for this verse is documented in Sahih Muslim 1456a. During the campaign of Hunayn, Muslim fighters captured women who had pagan husbands back in their villages. The companions felt uncomfortable having sexual relations with these women because their husbands were literally still alive. So, what was the divine response? Muhammad announced verse 24, declaring that capture in war automatically invalidates a woman's existing marriage. The moment she becomes spoils of war, her prior marital bonds cease to exist, making her sexually available to her captors. Apologists try to contextualize this as ancient warfare practice, but this isn't a historical narrative describing what men did. This is a divine command sanctifying the sexual exploitation of captive women. A woman whose home was destroyed and whose husband was defeated is forcibly subjected to the sexual desires of her captors under the blessing of divine law. Whenever women in early Islam raised questions about why men held all the power, money, and religious privileges, verse 32 was the ultimate divine shutdown. Apologists love to quote the middle part of this verse out of context. For a man is a share, and for women is a share. They paint it as a statement of economic equality, but read the opening command. It literally tells women, stop wishing for what men have. Why was it revealed? According to Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Jami'at Tirmihi, and Al-Tabari, Salama, one of Muhammad's wives, explicitly asked, O Messenger of Allah, men go to battle and fight, but we do not, and we only get half of the inheritance. Other women asked why spiritual rewards or legal privileges seem titled toward men. Verse 32 was revealed specifically to quell this early female pushback. Instead of granting women equal legal, financial, or political rights, the text reclassifies female discontent as envy, hasad. It effectively tells women, do not question why men were created superior in status, decision making, and inheritance. God designed the hierarchy this way, so just accept your lower position. The verse redirects a real world demand for civil equality into a promise of spiritual rewards in the next life. Men get real, tangible, earthly dominance, legal authority, double inheritance, polygamy, political leaderships. Women get told, be quiet, don't covet what men have, and pray for God's bounty in heaven. Tafsir Al-Qurtubi and Al-Razi explicitly state that this verse enforces the idea that God favored men over women in intellect, leadership, legal status, and religious duties. Whenever Muslim apologists talk about verse 4, they market it as a massive triumph for female independence. They point out that before Islam, a woman's dowry, mahr, went straight to her father or male guardian, treating her like property being sold off. Islam changed that by commanding that the mahr go directly to the woman herself. Sounds empowering, right? Until you look at why Islamic jurisprudence requires the dowry in the first place and what it actually purchases. According to Tafsir Ibn Kathir and Al-Qurtubi, pre-Islamic Arab guardians routinely took the bride's dowry for themselves. Verse 4 was revealed to make the payment an obligatory legal requirement, nihla, payable directly to the bride. Why is it fundamentally misogynistic? In classical Islamic legal theory, fiqh, across all major legal schools, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, marriage, nikah, is explicitly defined as a contract of ownership over sexual access. The mahr isn't a gesture of love. It is legally classified as the consideration or price paid in exchange for boost, exclusive sexual enjoyment, and ta'ah, female obedience. This legal reality is proven by the rule of mu'ajjal, prompt dowry. Under Islamic law, if a husband fails to pay the agreed upon dowry, the wife has the legal right to withhold physical intimacy. Why? Because the exchange hasn't been paid. The legal contract views the dowry as a transaction fee that legitimizes a man's access to a woman's body. In Surah An-Nisa, marriage is fundamentally a financial exchange where a man pays a fee to secure exclusive control over a woman's sexuality and obedience. Apologists frequently point to verse 25 to claim that Islam elevated enslaved women by encouraging men to marry them. But when you strip away the modern spin, verse 25 strictly codifies a two-tiered class system where enslaved women are explicitly demoted to a inferior legal, social, and human status. According to Tafsir Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari, this verse addresses impoverished Muslim men. If a man is too poor for a free woman, he can resort to an enslaved girl instead. The text doesn't promote equality. It treats an enslaved woman's dignity as a discounted commodity. The verse explicitly states that marrying a slave girl is a secondary measure meant only for men who lack the financial means for a free woman. Later in the exact same verse, the Quran commands that if an enslaved wife commits adultery, her punishment is half that of a free woman. While apologists frame this as mercy, classical jurisprudence fiqh explicitly bases this on personhood because an enslaved person is legally considered half a person in legal stature. Her accountability, social standing, and human value are locked at 50%. In Surah An-Nisa, womanhood isn't a unified status of human dignity. The chapter deliberately fragments women into higher and lower classes, ensuring that the most vulnerable women remain owned, traded, and treated as cheap substitutes for men who can't afford the real thing. When you step back and look at the complete picture of Surah An-Nisa, the pattern is impossible to ignore. From polygamy and wife beating to half inheritance, slave concubinage, and the financial contracts of marriage, this chapter doesn't liberate women, it systematically subordinates them. This isn't divine justice or progressive liberation. It is the codification of a 7th century patriarchal control, frozen in time as eternal law. We're just getting started. Each of these verses carries a history, a legal framework, and a human impact that deserves a full, detailed breakdown. So hit follow so you don't miss them. Throughout history, our moral standards have fluctuated, dipping lower in some eras than in others. This rigid system was born out of one of those moral valleys. To freeze a historical dip and force it upon all of time is a profound injustice to humankind. It is time to learn. It is time to leave it in the past.